Hey everybody, welcome to the Think and Read podcast. I'm Tom Vieira. This is a podcast where we think that thinking is worth doing and great books are worth reading. And we've got a great one in front of us now, Blaise Pascal's The Pensée. This is episode 7 in our series on Pascal. And if you like what you hear, you want to learn more about Pascal, you can find my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. And, like, subscribe, tell a friend, all that good stuff. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoy this. So, in this episode, I take up what most people probably think of first when they think of Blaise Pascal, and that is his famous wager, which seems like an argument for God's existence. Now, I probably should say something first about why on earth I waited 7 episodes to bring up the wager. And that was completely intentional. I'll just share my own story, my own experience with Pascal's thought. So I had known a little bit about Pascal being this, brilliant scientist and mathematician. Even there, I really didn't know a whole lot. I knew that he was. The only thing I really knew about Pascal until a few years ago was the wager. And I wasn't all that impressed, to be honest. It just seemed like a flimsy argument for God's existence, and a really odd one at that. Sort of, like I'm supposed to bet on God's existence because I'm better off that way than not. Pretty strange way to put the whole matter regarding eternity and God. Anyway, never really paid much attention to it, and until I actually read this book, and I sort of paid attention to other things that Pascal was saying about the world and reason and human nature and so on. And then I got to the wager and I said, I really wasn't understanding it very well. I'd made some mistakes. And I think they're pretty common mistakes, in fact, in how we think about the wager. I paid attention to there's a lot of stuff, on the internet and elsewhere about the wager. A lot of noise out there, a lot of dialogue back and forth, defenses for it, critiques of it, and a fair amount of misunderstanding about what he's actually trying to do here. And so what I would like to do, the bulk of this episode will be on 4 key mistakes that are made about the wager, our understanding about the wager. Okay. And I want to make it very clear that my goal is not to either defend or to critique the wager. My goal is clarity. I really want to understand what Pascal is saying here before I move to any kind of agreement or disagreement. Okay. So again, the fact that this is episode 7, we're finally getting to the wager is completely intentional. What are some things from previous episodes that we really ought to be keeping in mind as we get to the wager? Well, I think we should remember that, first of all, reason is a limited deal, that we can't know all things, and we can't know things by way of reason with the kind of mathematical certainty that Descartes, for example, wanted to have. We can only go so far with reason, in other words, and reason's vulnerable at that. There's a lot of things that can affect our ability to be rational. And in addition, there are things that we can know not by reason, but, as Pascal says, know by the heart. Except that the heart is not, for Pascal, an emotional center, an emotional faculty. It's more of an intuitive faculty. We sort of intuitively or instinctively are aware of certain basic features of reality, things like space and time. These sort of serve as starting points for reasoning. Okay, that's an important piece to this. And then one last point that I really think is worth stressing as we head into talking about the wager, and that is, for Pascal, nature is ambivalent when it comes to God's existence. There's no real settling the matter by a careful use of reason, exploring the natural world, and coming to some clear, conclusive decision on God's existence or non-existence. It's really, really critical for Pascal. That's a presupposition he has heading into the wager. I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But first, before I take up those 4 errors on the wager, let's get just a quick summary on what the wager is. Very roughly, what is Pascal doing here? Okay, so I think we're supposed to imagine somebody like an agnostic or a skeptic, somebody who's on the fence about God's existence and not really quite sure one way or another, that sort of thing. Pascal probably had in mind some people that he knew, some friends or acquaintances that he had who were basically nominal Catholics. They were, maybe in some external sense Catholic, but internally, intellectually, they either just weren't really sure or were skeptical in some sense about God, religion, and so on. So in any case, somebody like that, reasonably well-educated, can sort of take up the question of what would be the most reasonable thing to do here. And I think it's important to note for Pascal that the most reasonable thing to do, it has built into it this idea of self-interest. He says, when we're thinking about our own happiness, right, what's the most reasonable thing to do? So he says, okay, look, there's 2 objective possibilities. Objectively, either God exists or God does not exist. And there's 2 subjective possibilities as well, that you either believe in God or you do not believe in God. So there's actually a grand total of 4 possibilities, right? Because for somebody who believes, either God is or God is not, and for somebody who does not believe, either God is or God is not. And then Pascal says, look, which one of those makes the most sense? And so let's take up somebody who believes, all right? So a believer where it turns out that God actually does exist. So in that scenario, you lost nothing for your believing that God exists, but you gain everything. Okay? So for somebody who believes in God, and let's say it turns out that God doesn't exist. Okay? So you lost nothing for your believing and you gained nothing because it turns out that God wasn't real after all. Okay? So for the believer, the worst case scenario is a gain nothing, lose nothing scenario. Let's go to the non-believer now. So the guy who does not believe, and let's say it turns out that he's right. There's no God, okay, and so he lost nothing by believing, and he gained nothing because there's no God. But let's say for the guy who's a non-believer that God actually does exist. In that case, he gained nothing by his believing, and he lost everything because it turns out that God actually does exist. And then Pascal says, okay, so for the believer, the worst case scenario, a gain nothing, lose nothing scenario, actually turns out to be the best case scenario for the non-believer. Gain nothing, lose nothing. Now you tell me which is the most reasonable scenario for somebody to have. You ought to bet that God exists. Something like that is what Pascal has in mind, right? Key mistake number 1. Assuming that the wager is an argument for God's existence. I really think this is the most important problem or most important error. Because when we think of an argument for God's existence, what we're talking about are reasons or premises that lead to some conclusion that says, therefore, God exists. And so there are these sort of classical arguments for God's existence. I identify 4 of them. I kind of think of these 4 main ones. Maybe there's other ones, but there's 4. The first one, the ontological argument. I've actually touched on this in a previous episode. Anselm is very famous for this argument. Descartes actually uses it as well. Basically, it's this idea that when we look out in the world, there are greater and lesser degrees of goodness, and some things are more good, more beautiful, more perfect, or whatever than other things. And so there's got to be some thing that is the greatest in terms of perfection, goodness, beauty, etc. But it can't just be an imagined thing, because then it wouldn't be the greatest thing. For it to be the greatest in terms of beauty and perfection and so on. It actually has to exist. And so that than which we can imagine nothing more good, more beautiful, more perfect is God. Therefore God exists. Something like that. Okay. The cosmological argument, secondly. Thomas Aquinas famously gives this as one of his 5 arguments for God's existence. The cosmological argument is the idea that there must be a first cause to the universe. When we look around in the universe, again, it's kind of, this is a very inductive sort of argument. Nothing is the cause of itself. I don't cause myself. You don't cause yourself. Nothing causes itself. And so, everything must have been caused. But those things had to have also been caused themselves. And so we can't really go back forever in a chain of cause and effect. And therefore, there had to have been a first cause, and that is what we call God. Therefore, God exists. Okay, the third argument, the teleological argument. Aquinas also gives this one. Paley gives this one. Basically, it's the design argument. There's an apparent design to the universe. There's an orderliness to it, and so on. And so there must be some designer that is good enough and powerful enough and wise enough to have created the universe with this kind of design, and that must be God. Therefore, God exists. And one more argument is an argument from morality. There looks to be an objective morality in the world. C.S. Lewis is famous for this argument. Fyodor Dostoevsky kind of gives a variation on this as well. That if there is an objective moral right and moral wrong, or a moral law, let's say, there must be a lawgiver. And that is what we call God. Therefore, God exists. Okay, so with those arguments, right, we now take up the wager and we go, okay, is the wager like those? And the answer is no, it's not like those. And in fact, I think we have to remember that for Pascal, no such argument for God's existence exists. At least nothing that's really compelling, nothing that's going to work. He rejects the idea that we can really get to God that way. That is by way of reason. Let me read to you a passage from Pascal. And he puts the matter in a pretty direct, fairly strong sort of way about what we can get from nature. We read, "This is what I see and what troubles me. I look around in every direction and all I see is darkness. Nature has nothing to offer me that does not give rise to doubt and anxiety. If I saw no sign there of a divinity, I should decide on a negative solution. If I saw signs of a creator everywhere, I should peacefully settle down into the faith. But seeing too much to deny and not enough to affirm, I am in a pitiful state, where I have wished 100 times over that if there is a God supporting nature, she should unequivocally proclaim him. And if the signs in nature are deceptive, they should be completely erased. That nature should say all or nothing, so that I could see what course I ought to follow." I'll pause there. Too much to deny God's existence, and not enough to affirm God's existence. That's the key line in that passage. So, right there and elsewhere, Pascal tells us there's no proof for God's existence. Let me add to that. Even if we could prove God by reason, Pascal entertains this as well. So even if we could prove it by reason, he says it's useless. We don't really have the true God. What we have is what he calls the God of the philosophers. He says it ends up in pride, really, because what we end up with, if we can prove God by reason, okay, he says what we have is knowledge of God apart from the knowledge of our own wretchedness. And that just lands us in pride. Okay, and it's a lot like, let's say the opposite were to be the case, that we have knowledge of our own wretchedness, but we don't have knowledge of God. That just lands us in despair. Okay, so in another passage, we read this. He says, "And that is why I shall not undertake here to prove by reasons from nature either the existence of God, or the Trinity, or the immortality of the soul, or anything of that kind. Not just because I should not feel competent to find in nature arguments which would convince hardened atheists, but also because Such knowledge without Christ is useless and sterile. If someone were convinced that the proportions between numbers are immaterial, eternal truths, depending on a first truth in which they subsist, called God, I should not consider that he had made much progress toward his salvation. So a couple things to see here, right? That, first of all, arguments for God don't really convince hardened atheists. Pascal himself is just not convinced that that's the case. I think, that there's a lot of probably evidence that we have now that would support this. I think Pascal would say, look, there's atheists can always find reasons to doubt. Okay. So the arguments for God aren't really effective. And even if you could show God by reason, it doesn't really bring you to Christ. And that's really the key, because it's Christ for Pascal that shows us both God and wretchedness. And you don't encounter Christ by reason. You encounter Christ by faith. He said it's the heart that perceives God and not reason. Okay, so mistake number one, thinking that the wager is some kind of argument for God's existence, is really a non-starter. Pascal would deny that from the get-go. Key mistake number two, overlooking the opening of the wager. I think this is an important mistake, that a lot of times when we take up the wager, we just jump right to where Pascal says, we must wager, and he goes on to talk about the different possibilities and so on, and what makes the most sense for us, and we skip the opening of the wager. And there's something really interesting going on. In fact, I'm not going to read literally the first few lines, but toward the beginning, he says that we know that the infinite exists without knowing its nature, just as we know that it is untrue that numbers are finite. Right? Whenever you're counting, you can always add one more number. And so he continues. He says, thus it is true that there's an infinite number, but we don't know what that is. It's untrue that it's even. It's untrue that it's odd, for by adding a unit, it does not change its nature, and yet it's a number. And every number is even or odd. So he concludes, therefore we may well know that God exists without knowing what he is. So I think he's appealing here to that intuitive faculty that we have connected to the heart in the previous episode, right? That there is some intuitive sense or awareness of God, just like there's an intuitive sense or awareness of infinity. And we don't encounter infinity. We don't know that infinity exists because we've seen it or we've demonstrated it by way of proof or something. We know it intuitively. And God's sort of like that. Okay. So I think that's really important, as we head into the wager, he almost prefaces the wager that way. Right? So don't expect, in other words, when we head into the wager, some kind of discursive reasoning, right? Some kind of argument moving from premises to a conclusion that says, therefore God exists. This is something we know by way of the heart already. Okay. Key mistake number 3, thinking that wagering is optional. I've heard this before, that, somebody's saying something like, I don't really like the wager. It makes me uncomfortable that, we're sort of taking up the matter of eternity and God, and we're kind of putting it into a gambling scenario. You don't bet on eternity. It's not something that you gamble on and so on, right? But, look, I think somebody who believes that you can settle the matter of God by way of reason and argument is really not going to find much value in the wager, right? But, I think Pascal says to you, look, the only way into the wager, the only way this is going to really be of value to you if you already agree with me that reason and argument is not going to settle the matter. So this is the premise, the presupposition of the whole thing, right? It's where you start. The gateway, in other words, to the wager is, again, the ambivalence of nature and really the limitedness of reason. Nature is dark. for Pascal when it comes to God's existence, and reason is limited. It just doesn't bring us there. And that's why he says we must wager. There's no not wagering. Everyone is going to have to decide, right, at some point or another, either to believe in God or not to believe, right? There is no not wagering. Key mistake number 4, the final one. Thinking that the wager is some kind of sufficient basis for becoming a Christian. Let's say you hear the wager, you were kind of, suspicious of God, and, you're an agnostic or whatever, and you hear Pascal on this and you go, you know what, that makes sense. It is reasonable. I'm gonna bet on God, right? I'm gonna bet that God exists. Okay. And I've heard people like Alex O'Connor kind of critique the wager as though it's sort of this it's this really terrible argument, like it's some kind of cosmic insurance policy to cover your rear just in case God actually ends up existing, right? How could such a person be a Christian, right? How could that? And he's right in one. That person's not a Christian for Pascal. But the assumption by O'Connor and others is that the critique is that, well, that person couldn't be a Christian, right? And as though Pascal thinks that somehow that's sufficient for somebody to be a Christian. If you're sort of convinced by the wager, then that means you're a believer, right? No, that's not what Pascal thinks. Okay. And I think it's not really paying close enough attention to other things that Pascal has said in the Pensée. Okay. I mean, it's a clue right away, first of all, that the wager is pitched in terms of self-interest. I already pointed that out. It's like, what's in your best interest here, in terms of placing a bet? Okay. And being Christian is going to mean more than just, securing what is, most in your interest. We need to go to a different Pensée here in order to really pursue what Pascal says about this. It's Pensée 12 in the Penguin Classics version. He says, men despise religion, they hate it, and are afraid that it may be true. That's an interesting line. I don't want to pursue it here. He goes on and says, the cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Okay, so that's where the wager comes in. So he starts his Pensée by saying, look, men despise religion. We got somebody who really they don't want anything to do with religion, the church, Christianity, etc. Okay, and he says, what do you do? Well, I mean, the first thing is for such a person to come to realize that believing in God is not a crazy thing. It's not an irrational thing. That's where the wager comes in. You say, okay, it's not crazy that somebody's going to say, I believe in God. All right. But that's not the end of the matter. There's actually 2 more steps here that he offers. Secondly, make it attractive. That is, make good men wish it were true. Okay. And then thirdly, he says, show them that it is. So I'm going to touch on the show them that it is, the third step here in just a moment. But the key here again is for Pascal, the wager is only really the first step. It's just, it's not really, you're not really in Christianity yet. You're just open to the fact that somebody believing in God is not really, they're not really committing a kind of intellectual act of lunacy or something. Okay. So, all right, let's wrap up this episode with this, show them that it is, because I think if we misunderstand him there, then Pascal looks like he's obviously contradicting himself, because he's gone out of his way again to show that there is no showing that God is. And I don't take Pascal here to mean show by way of argument that God is, or that religion, that Christianity is true. And I wrestled with this a little bit. I was thinking, what is Pascal saying here? And so I'm gonna make a suggestion, a bit tentative, but I this is my best shot at what I think Pascal is up to. I think it's showing. So you show somebody, first of all, that believing in God is not an irrational thing. You make it attractive. Perhaps talking about things, the life of Jesus, let's say, so there's some things that are really beautiful there. And so it's appealing. Perhaps that's what he has in mind. But then it's like, show them that it is. I think he means by way of your life. Show them by way of your actions, by way of love, a kind of self-sacrificial love, so that in encountering you, I think this is what Pascal has in mind, that in some sense, people are encountering God. Encountering the church is in some sense encountering God. Sometimes Christians talk like that, right? Like they're like the church, sort of the hands and feet of Jesus, that kind of thing, which is interesting to me. I do think a guy like Fyodor Dostoevsky would have that view. That, when you encounter certain characters in his novels, it's something like encountering the face of Jesus Christ himself. And that does fit with Pascal on some level, right? Because we talked about in the Night of Fire vision that he had, it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not the God of the philosophers. That's the true God, right? And that's a God that you don't encounter by way of reason and argument. You encounter, you don't reason to, but you encounter the true God. So it fits that idea of encountering as the way that we know God. In any case, I will leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Our question is to think or not to think. Bye for now.